name is Lori Cohen. I'm the director of Beagle Freedom Canada. We have Mary and Bee here who are part of our team. Mary is the rescue and volunteer director. Bee is our IT and web fabulous magician. Thank you for being here. Thank you for registering. Thank you for all your support. We have Andrew Fenton, who I'm excited to get started because he's got so much information. He will kindly introduce himself. Thank you for turning your cameras on as well. What we'll do is I'll just have you guys stay muted while we listen to Andrew. And then if you want to just wave your hand in Zoom so that we see it, then if there's any questions, etc., then we can, you can unmute yourself and go ahead. So that way nobody's talking over each other. So thank you all again. Andrew, go ahead. We're looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. Thanks, Laurie. And thanks to Beagle Freedom Canada for the opportunity to do this. And I'm also grateful to be speaking from Mi'kma'ki, which is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people in Nova Scotia as part of that territory. I've got some contact information here. So the deal I always have with folks is if you have any questions that occur to you when this is all done, feel free to reach out to me. If you reach out to me at certain parts of the year when I'm busy with students, it may be slow in response, but I'll try to be as fast as I can if you have any questions. So I just some terms because they'll be coming up in this talk just unavoidably because we're talking about the Canadian Council of Animal Care. So you've got three agencies. These are the big three agencies in Canada that give funding to universities. And so because I'm a philosopher, I would be going to the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council if I was applying for grants. I've done it in the past just once. The Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council, that's the one that covers as described. These are designed as names to be very descriptive. It helps for folks working in government to understand what these agencies are, which is why they're not very subtle names, but that covers everything except medicine. And in the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, that covers medicine, 13 institutes there, which is why it's in the plural, for anything from aging through to cancer. And so for those of us working in universities across Canada, these are our agencies that we will apply for government funding. When I use the term scientific activities, it includes research, teaching, and testing. This is the standard language that's used in documents. So you'll find it in government documents. I will give the full references at the end of the talk and slides, and I'll also be sharing these slides with Laurie so that they can be posted for folks to look at afterwards as well. But scientific activities is quite inclusive. So it's not just research, it's not just testing, it'll include teaching as well. So what is the Canadian Council on Animal Care? So it's a non-governmental organization, also not-for-profit. It's charged with certifying institutions, and that will be any institutions that want to be certified by the CCAC. And it's a condition of tri-council funding. So that would be the ones I mentioned, so CHR, NSERC, and SHRC is what we call the one that I would be applying under to receive tri-council agency funds. There will be other funding agencies in Canada that will occasionally require certification. And if they do, then the institutions will have to become certified with the CCAC. It was created in 1968, so it's been around for a long time now. It's not accountable to any governmental office or ministry. If you go to the CCAC website, and you'll be able to do that if you look at one or two of the references I have towards the end of the slide, at the last slide for sources. You'll notice they talk about themselves being independent. That's basically what they mean. They don't actually report to anybody. Unfortunately, that means we can't hold them accountable, and that's a problem. The majority of their funds still come from CHR and NSERC. And so this is from their most recent annual report, these stats. So it's 55.2% of their budget comes from those two of the three tri-agencies. The rest of the funding mostly comes from what they call program participation fees, and that's what institutions like my university will pay to be certified through the CCAC. It's very heavily influenced by scientists. I serve on one of the subcommittees, and there's lots of them on that subcommittee. Of course, CIHR and NSERC represent the community of scientists in those relevant areas of research. And so there's a huge influence of science animal users on the CCAC. As you can imagine, so this shouldn't come as a surprise, that will lead you to rightfully expect the CCAC to be relatively conservative in the directions it takes on oversight of animal use among those who are certified. It doesn't enjoy the force of law. So though the condition of agreement with the tri-agencies is if we're going to receive funding from the three I mentioned right at the beginning, our institutions must have a good animal practice certification from the Canadian Council of Animal Care. There's no law that we would break if we didn't. We would just arguably lose access to those funds. I'll speak to that in a little bit later. It's a complicated claim, and I'll say why in a few minutes. So the CCAC certifies institutions. So this will be, if you go to their site, they'll give you a list of them. There's a number of them. There's over 200, I think, last I looked. And it'll include all the major universities in Canada, including Dalhousie University, which is where I work. Now, I say technically, and I'll keep adding to why I'm very tentative in what I say here, but technically these institutions are supposed to adhere to CCAC standards and guidelines to maintain their certification. Now, it's only been a rumor that no one's been able to actually verify, and I have never heard it verified by anyone working or representing the CCAC, that there is only one institution that's ever lost its certification. Remember, these folks have been around since '68, and it's only a rumor. I've never seen any evidence of this. As far as I know, no one has ever lost their certification. Now, that shouldn't be understood to mean that everyone has been in full compliance with CCAC standards. That would be a hasty generalization from that. Again, think of who's funding this organization, the influence of animal scientists in the running of this organization, and you'll get a sense of why that might be the case. There's also other things that will come out in the slide as to why that's not likely to happen, but that's the technical rule. Now, the CCAC cannot, and I mean cannot, decertify specific scientists, labs, or teams. That means if you have a bad acting scientist, lab, or team, the only thing that the CCAC can do is decertify the whole institution. That is, if it was a university like mine, the whole of Dalhousie University. They can't target the team or the lab or the scientist. Now, potentially in the agreement of the three councils, these are possible results of that. If in fact there's what they call in the agreement a material breach, you can ask me what that means. It's not explained in the agreement. I think they call it a default, but that's going to be the judgment of the relevant heads of these agencies as to whether this is going to count. But if you, for instance, fail to have a good animal practice certification from the CCAC, that can mean potentially, and I underline potentially, that all of the researchers that are receiving tri-council agency funds at the university may lose it, and the funds that are there may actually have to not be distributed to those that need them. Now, I say potentially because, again, there's only been a rumor that one institution ever lost its certification, and this is the important end, I have never heard of anyone losing access to funding at any institution that would be certified because of a breach of the agreement that I've just referenced. And so all of this is very tentative because it's never been tested. I mean, I don't know what would happen if they lost their certification. According to the agreement, these are potential ramifications, but those are pretty serious ramifications for a whole university. And so it shouldn't be a surprise that it hasn't happened. In fact, given that the CCAC can only do this if they were going to do something this significant, that is affect the whole institution, you can begin to understand why it might not happen, because it's a nuclear option. It affects everybody, not just the bad actors. And just to fill out, don't read this as everyone is in compliance. I was just looking at the annual report today. That's the most recent one. And there's 11 institutions on probation. Now, what they mean by that, they don't explain. They don't identify the institutions, and they don't identify if they've been on probation for a while. But we do know from the report that 11 are. They haven't been decertified, they're just on probation, whatever that would mean.
Andrew,
Yep.
sorry, may I interrupt at this point?
Sure.
The
Sure.
probation, I'm just curious. So
Yeah.
there's no guidelines on the probation. So you don't know who the institutions are, is what you're saying.
No. Yeah.
Don't know what the offenses would be.
Yep. Have no idea.
Okay. And is there a list of offenses that would somewhere that we would know what they could be for somebody to actually be on probation?
That's a good question. Technically, yes. So to actually be in non-compliance with the Canadian Council on Animal Care, you would have to not be following their guidelines, and so there'd have to be some kind of violation of the guidelines. Now, that's the best you're going to get out of them, is there has to be a violation. Now, what violation that would be, you'll never get out of them. What the animals, how the animals were being used at time of violation, you'll never get out of them. You'll never even get out of them what region of the country that happened in. It's not going to happen. And as far as I understand the Freedom of Information laws in Canada, they're not even falling under that, because they're not a government agency. They're independent of government, and so I don't think you can actually. The American term for this is FOIPOP them. You can't even do a Freedom of Information Act, because they don't fall under that jurisdiction, and so they have no obligation to release this information.
Okay, yeah, I'm just curious. Well, that I knew. I actually asked Camille Labchuk that, and she confirmed that they are not under the Freedom of Information Act, so you can't ask them for anything.
Yep.
So I'm just curious if there's a time frame of probation that they would have to, the organization would have to comply, or does it sit there, you know? It's a
good question. It's very difficult. From the outside, we don't know. I mean, the CCAC here is just opaque. You just can't see through their barriers of non-transparency. And so, I mean, although I serve in one of the subcommittees, they would never tell me. I would never have access to that kind of information. I have no idea. They do have 3 levels of warning that they give institutions. You have a serious level, and that they have a major level, and that major level has to be something that the institution must address immediately if they're going to maintain good standing with the organization. Then you have a serious one, and they've got 3 months to actually respond to those recommendations. And then you have a regular level, and that one isn't a crisis. It's there's just, you know, in the normal running of these organizations, something will fall out, or, you know, some of the holdings, the cages may not be cleaned properly, or may not be kept up to a relevant standard, or the size might be wrong, something like that. So that'd be the regular. So you got those 3 levels. You got major, serious, and regular. You can see this on their website. If you go to the website, you can get all of those details. Okay. And so that'll give you a sense of how they're warned. But again, because they're not transparent, nor are they accountable, we can't actually challenge them to give us any details about how long someone's been on probation. This is all controlled in-house, and they are not accountable to anybody on the outside.
Okay. Well, thank you, and sorry for interrupting.
No, please do. Anytime, jump in. Again, I'm used to this in a classroom context, so it's quite natural for me to stop, even mid-sentence if something comes up.
Well, I'll try not to do that. So thank you.
No worries. I don't mind that at all. Totally enjoy it. So the Canadian Council of Animal Care, they're beginning to foreground rehoming. So this ties us right back into the mandate of Beagle Freedom Canada as an option that for suitable animals, and that's important to underline. So it'll depend on their age. It'll depend on the history of their use. It'll depend on their welfare state. It'll depend on what the options are. It'll also depend on law. So if in fact there are statutes in any province or territory that would restrict what a research facility could do with their animals, that will impact anything the CCAC says about rehoming, because when they talk about rehoming, they always have as a background caveat, as long as it complies with relevant regulations and law. Now, in Canada, there is no federal legislation governing the use of animals in science. There are, various protection acts across provinces and territories in Canada. There is only one statute, and that's in Ontario, that's dedicated to the use of animals in research. I was looking at it a few days ago. There is no mention of the Canadian Council of Animal Care in it. There's no mention of the 3Rs, which are about to come up, which is curious. And I haven't seen anything in the supplementary regulations for that act to indicate that they have any role to play in this. And so that's a pretty unique thing. And they also have restrictions, and this is why I bring it in now. They also have restrictions on what a facility can do with their dogs and cats. From what I can understand of reading that statute in Ontario, it's not just any dog or cat, it's dogs and cats that they got from pounds or shelters. And so for the research facilities themselves cannot rehome those animals directly. Those pound cats and dogs must go back to the pound. And then the pound gets to decide, or the shelter gets to decide what to do with those animals. And so that would be an example in Canada of where, even if the CCAC has strong recommendations for rehoming, how laws in various provinces could impact how that gets worked out.
Okay, actually, and that's primarily an Ontario thing, and someone correct me if I'm wrong. Is that correct? Where, and I think it, forgive me, I think it's called pound seizure. No, I might be mixing it up with the States, but it's pound seizure, I think, in the States, and pound release here, I think. But that's in Ontario. That only happens in Ontario. Is that correct?
To the best of my knowledge. So again, the only province or territory that has a dedicated statute to animals and research is Ontario. And so when I was reading their statute, that's when I ran across the restrictions on what a facility can do for relocating their, and again, my reading is right, pound cats and dogs, not other dogs and cats, but pound dogs and cats.
Right.
When I was reading the supplementary regulations, because statutes often come with regulations that help enforcement, help interpretation of the law. Again, it seemed to be pound cats and dogs, but I've only seen anything like that in Ontario. I've seen nothing like in Nova Scotia. They don't have anything like that. The only reference you have to animals in research in the Nova Scotia Animal Protection Act is a couple of paragraphs where they go, well, if the officer thinks there's an offense, they should actually go to the chair of the committee, that is the Animal Care Committee, and also figure out whether the institution or facility is certified with the CCAC. And whatever happens, no charges can be brought against an institution if, in fact, even if they're not a part of the CCAC auditing system or certification system, if they actually cohere to the guidelines of the CCAC, there's nothing to prosecute. So even if it's in a violation of the Animal Protection Act in Nova Scotia, if it meets the guidelines of the CCAC, they're covered.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna talk because I see there's two hands up. So since you're okay with it, Andrew,
yeah.
I see. Go ahead, Julia, if you want to start.
Oh yeah, hi. So I'm from America, and I was just wondering, like, what the equivalent in America is of the CCAC. I think it's the AWA, but I'm not sure. Would that be like the American equivalent?
Right. I mean, what you're asking is there any agency in particular in the US that would be charged with overseeing the use of animals in science? The short answer to that, as far as I know, and it's been a while since I've dipped my toes into the US regulatory ecology, let's call it an ecology, because it's all very complex and feeds into each other, is there's a number of agencies that are actually possible depending on the animals you're talking about. So the USDA is an organization that you can reach out to. The NIH, the National Institutes of Health, is another organization because they do a lot of animal funding. But so does the USDA. The FDA, it's not crazy to look up where their jurisdiction would be, because they actually approve stuff that has to do with the consumption of food, as well as I think drugs. It's going to overlap there with animals, so they don't have anything centralized. The AWA, that's the Animal Welfare Act, and so that's That it does mention scientific use of animals in the Animal Welfare Act. Unfortunately, it excludes mice, rats, birds, and cold-blooded animals, and so there's a whole bunch of animals in the US that aren't actually covered by the Animal Welfare Act because they don't count as animals. So rats, mice, birds, and cold-blooded animals don't count as animals under the Animal Welfare Act. Now, that doesn't mean that they lack any protection. There is an accreditation organization that's an informal accreditation organization of laboratories around the world. Lots of laboratories get accredited with that organization, and I forget its name, has a number of A's and L's in it. But it for optics, a number of labs do that, and they hold they would hold to certain guidelines that would cover rats and mice and birds and cold-blooded animals. And then if you're going to get funding from organizations like the NIH requires you to follow their guidelines on the use of mammals and science. Is actually one of their guidebooks is on mammal use in science. And so if you were going to receive NIH funding, you would have to cohere with their guidelines. Now that begins to sound like what I've been talking about with Canada, with the tri-agencies, right? So if you think of CHR or NSERC, if you're going to get their funding, you have to have a certification with the CCAC that shows that you're compliant with their guidelines. That's actually pretty similar to what's going on with the NIH when it comes to their funding. And so if you're going to receive their funding, you better toe the line on their guidelines, at least on paper. How this works out, in fact, you need to talk to a practicing lawyer. There's been this big story about in Vigo and the dog breeding facility where they seized a number of dogs. That's the power of legislation in the United States. That sort of thing is lacking in Canada. And so that's an impressive legislative ecology for protecting those animals. Now, put protection in scare quotes. If you've been reading anything about the Vigo case, lots of those dogs suffered terribly, and so they weren't well protected.
They just released like 4,000 of them today, I think, but they're not releasing them to the Beagle Freedom Project. They're releasing them to just random shelters that don't know how to care for them because they're special needs dogs.
Yeah. No, it's very sad.
Yeah. Actually, I'd like to speak to that if I may, because
Sure.
I did work with Beagle Freedom, and then I'll sorry, Carla, I see your hands up, but I'll just speak to that. So yeah, we're trying to be, well, let's just say that the animals that are going to from in Vigo, we do know from the Humane Society, the U.S. Humane Society, the HSUS, we have contacted them, etc. So they are going to reputable places, and they are endeavoring, and they do have a lot of resources that they've shared. So in case anyone is very concerned about the animals and the care that they're going to have, we're pretty confident. It's such a monumental situation that's gone on in the States. I mean, we can all agree that we hope that we can make this kind of difference in Canada, and we can do that kind of, make a difference in legislation here. But I think there's a little bit of back and forth going on, and we are pretty confident that the HSUS is only giving the dogs to some very reputable rescues. And so we feel really positive about it. We know some of them, we've been in contact with them personally, some of them. So we feel really good from our end that the animals are going to be cared for, at least. And that's, and that they've been saved, they're not tortured anymore. And we feel good about what the HSUS has done from the Beagle Freedom Canada standpoint. So we're just really focusing on what an absolutely monumental win this is for animals. And they really are going to go to good homes with people who are educated. So it's a celebration today for those animals, that's for sure. So, and thank you, Julia, and thank you for all your messages too on Instagram. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, Carla, sorry for listening to me rattle on about that. So sorry.
Just a couple of questions. So at our university, every university, I understand, at least in Ontario, has to have an animal care committee. So anybody within the university that wants to work with they apply to that, and that committee supposedly makes sure that they're in keeping with CCAC.
Right.
So in terms of these people that are on, but the university, from what I gather, you say is who gets charged, not individual labs or scientists or et cetera. So my question is, is it whistleblowers that get in touch with CCAC? And I'm presuming that given that these are all people that use animals, that even to be on probation, probably the stuff's pretty egregious. Those are and last question. Do they do forced breeding within the labs? Is that where they get some of the animals?
Yeah, those are lots of good questions. So just for the probation stuff, again, they're very opaque. So we have no idea. And I'm not sure there's any way to find out unless you were in the system with access to that information, and then you're under gag not to share it. I mean, I'm under gag on the committee I'm under, but it's just because it allows for freedom of discussions about what we're debating as we revise the document we're working on. But if you're working in-house in the system, you'd be under a gag order not to share certain stuff. And so there's no way to find that out. It's a good question. I want to know the answer to that question, and there's just no way to find out. For the Ontario, what complicates Ontario University here is you've got an Ontario statute plus the agreement of the tri-agencies for the certification with CCAC, and so you got two layers there. Right. And so you're right. The universities that are all certified with the CCAC, they must have an animal care committee. You're also right that under Ontario statute, everyone that's using animals in research must actually do it in a way that coheres with the guidelines, but it doesn't mean they have to be certified with the CCAC. It just means that when an officer that's enforcing this particular statute on the use of animals in research, when they're enforcing it, they must be cognizant of the guidelines and whether these facilities meet them, because if they do, then there's no offense under the statute in Ontario. And so that would be even for private institutions that aren't certified with the CCAC because they don't receive Tri-Council policy funding, but must be cohering with the guidelines because of the statute in Ontario. So that makes it complicated for university. The universities in Ontario that will be, the usual big ones, they'll all be certified with the CCC because there'll be researchers on campus that get Tri-Council funding. So you'll have people like me or others in the social sciences and arts. You'll have folks in engineering or physics or biology or whatever, as well as in faculties of medicine who will be getting Tri-Council funding. And so any of those institutions that are eligible for that funding must be certified with the CCAC. And that'll be most mainstream universities, if not all mainstream universities in Ontario, if that helps. But it's complicated because of that statute, right? Ontario is really because you get those two layers. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, this is all with the caveat that I'm a philosopher that works in this area. Camille Labchuk is also one of my go-to people for asking her about animal law. So that's who I would go to if you ask me a hard question and I go, I don't know what to say to that. I'll go to Camille. Or I have a couple of people that one is retired from Schulich Law School here at Dal, and one that continues to teach in animal law, and they're also my go-to people. I got three who I bug when someone asks me a good question on animal law. But I'm fairly comfortable with all of those responses. I think that works.
Thank you. Thanks, Carter.
Yeah. Yeah, good set of questions.
Okay.
Should I keep going with the slide?
Yeah, please do. Please go ahead. Thanks, Andrew.
So the rehoming, so you see two appearances that jumped out to me. So the first one that jumped out to me, not in chronological order, was the draft of the guidelines for end of study outcomes for animals that came out. I think it was released for public feedback in November of 2021. And it's a draft. What's important here is that there are a number of layers of review and revision within the CCAC of documents. So I only know this because I'm on one of the subcommittees, and so we've been on it for a few years now, actually. So we're still in the process of revisions and review and revisions. So you'll get expert review, you'll get a review from the the directors of standards, and then you have public review. And this was a public review where it was released to everybody that wanted to read it. And then you could send in feedback to the CCAC by a certain period of time. And then they collate all that feedback, and then they decide on the relevant committee how they're going to accommodate that feedback, if they're going to accommodate it at all. And if they're not, they need to have at least from my subcommittee, you need to have reasons for not accommodating it. You can't just dismiss it. You got to reason it through and figure out whether it's appropriate, or really belongs to something else, or it's outside the purview of the CCAC, those kinds of things. And so in that end of study outcomes for animals guidelines, draft guidelines, rehoming is actually the first option they give you for dealing with animals who are no longer useful for science. And that's a huge deal. It's nice to see rehoming right there at the top. And it's right there before you get euthanasia as the last option in this list, if memory serves me right. In the guidelines for non-human primates, because I just went looking after that for other guidelines that might mention rehoming, and that one pops up. And so it's a fairly long set of guidelines for non-human primates. And in their chapter or section on end of study, rehoming is also mentioned there. And they're relevantly similar in the way that they talk about rehoming. I've mentioned to you all the caveats about, it depends on the health of the animal, the history of the animal, the age of the animal, their welfare state, and the regulations in the context in which the facility operates, and where, depending on the animal, where the relevant shelter operates, or a sanctuary. Or homes, if any facilities can do this directly to folks in their community to adopt, say, a cat or even a rat. So some ethics here can help you understand what's going on with the CCAC, because this is not done without motivation. There's actually growing motivation here for the CCAC to take this seriously, and this is to their credit. They may not be a perfect organization, but this is a change that's coming out of a certain kind of commitment they're making to ethics. So let's chat about ethics for a second, so you can get, and it's just a really brief foray into this. So in human research ethics in Canada, there's 3 principles that govern the use in humans and research that, again, are funded by, for instance, CIHR. And that is concern for welfare, respect for persons, and justice. And those are core principles within the Tri-Council policy. It has a long name, but it's shortened to Tri-Council policy for those of us that work at universities. And that just governs how humans are overseen in their participation in research. You can get this free online. Just put in Tri-Council policy, put in humans and research in the search, and you'll get the document. You can download it as a PDF or read it as HTML, I think. Now, it may surprise you, but there's actually no agreed upon ethics principles for the use of animals in research, like none that are agreed upon and widely instituted officially within oversight of animals. Now you have the 3 R's. These come out of a book done by William Russell and Rex Birch that had to do with humane technique of using animals in research. That was published in 1959. These are their 3 R's. Replacement is replacing sentient animals with something else. Now, that something else can get complicated. It can be another animal, but it must be the case to meet this understanding of replacement that either it's unlikely that they're going to suffer distress or pain, or they won't. That is, it's certain that they won't. And so that can mean that you're actually using animals who you have anesthetized, and they will not regain consciousness while you use them. That would count as replacement. I know that sounds like a cheat, but that's how it's understood. Reduction has to do with reducing numbers. There's 2 ways to understand that. The CCAC understands it as reducing any of the numbers that might otherwise be used of animals. That's consistent with what Russell and Birch had in mind in their book, but they also recommended that people use the least number necessary to get good science data. That's the view of reduction. It's quite widespread around the world, but it's not the CCAC's. The CCAC's view of this, if you go to their site, they'll explain their interpretation of the 3 R's. Reduction is any reduction in animal use. Refinement has to do with then dealing with the animals that are left. So if you've gone through a replacement stage and you go, well, we can't replace them, and these orders are very important for the 3 R's. Replacement comes first. So if you shouldn't, if you can avoid using sentient animals, you shouldn't. That's what replacement's about. And again, as long as they're not sentient, you can. So you can put them under anesthesia and make sure they never come back to consciousness. Then if you can't replace them, you go to reduction. So you reduce the number of animals you're going to use, either at all or to a statistical minimum. And then refinement kicks in. So now you've got to the animals you're going to use. You're proposing to use this number of animals. Refinement then has to do with eliminating all unnecessary pain and suffering and distress. Russell and Birch also wanted folks to take seriously the idea that they should actually make an effort to make their lives good, or as good as possible. So not just the elimination of distress and suffering, but also enrichment in their husbandry so that they could actually have, you know, as happy a life as they could. That was what Russell and Birch had in mind. And different agencies around the world interpret it usually very negatively. It has to do with eliminating unnecessary pain and suffering, rather than also including helping them have as good a life as possible. But the CCAC takes seriously that part as well, that over the lifetime of these animals, there should be efforts to actually enhance their welfare. But in the draft outline for the end of study outcomes, they do mention two ethics principles. Now, the ethics principle of non-maleficence, that's arguably lying behind the motivation for the 3 Rs. So the 3 Rs aren't ethics principles, they're procedural. They help you go through a procedure of reasoning and deciding what animals to use in the end. But they're all, you can reasonably understand them as a way of minimizing or avoiding harm. That's what non-maleficence is talking about. Do no harm is the way of understanding it in medicine. And that's a way of talking about non-maleficence. That appears in that draft guidelines for end of study outcomes. So does the principle of respect for animals. So these are two principles that actually enjoy special mention in that draft. Now, it is a draft, so things may change. But what's important about that is that those are two respectable ethics principles. And so that's actually pretty ground shaking to actually say, these are going to be our ethics principles, and these are actually going to govern what we do with these animals. It may not sound like a huge step, but in the oversight of using animals in research, that's actually pretty significant. Now, how does it connect with rehoming, those principles? I think they're quite friendly to rehoming. I would go as far, as you'll see in these slides, to argue that non-maleficence requires it. But it all comes down to whether you think killing is a harm. Now, ethicists will split on this. You're talking to an ethicist today that thinks that killing is a harm, at least on the face of it. There has to be more understood about the context before it isn't. So, you know, if the animal is really suffering and it's best to end that suffering, then that killing isn't a harm. I mean, it's a mercy. But unless it's something like that, I'm of the view that killing should be a harm. I can give you a justification for that later if you want to hear a justification for it. It's important to know that that draft guideline for end of study outcomes, it also says that killing is a harm. Oh. Now, what's important about that is, given that they've said that killing is a harm, that means if you don't have to kill them, you're harming them. And if non-maleficence is one of your central principles, you're violating that principle if you kill them and you didn't have to. And so that's actually pretty strongly in favor of doing something with those animals other than killing them. Respect for animals, it'll depend on whether you think unnecessarily killing an animal is disrespectful. And so that'll come down to your ideas of what respect are. It's going to be very difficult to get folks to define it. This has been a notoriously difficult concept to define in ethics, human or animal. And so here's my take on it. I think non-maleficence provides a strong support for rehoming, like very strong support, particularly if the relevant agency, like the CCAC, is willing to grant that killing ordinarily is a harm, unless, again, it's a mercy. Respect will support rehoming, because I do think it's difficult to say you're respecting an animal if you then go ahead and kill them when you don't have to. That's going to be a hard sell. But given that respect is a pliable concept, that is, you can pretty well interpret that any way you want. There will be folks that will disagree with that. But I think I would push them if I was having a coffee with them or a tea with them or a glass of water with them. I would push them on whether it would make sense to say they were treating an animal respectfully while admitting they'd killed them but didn't have to. But non-maleficence is the much stronger of the cases or principle to that, given that both of them are there in that draft document. That's huge. So it's good to see, here's the takeaways for this. It's good to see the CCAC foregrounding rehoming. It is important to see that they don't require it yet. It's where possible. That's the language that tends to be used. I hope that over time that'll change. The we there is basically me as I was writing the slide. I think if the CCAC commits to these principles, I think if they're going to be consistent, they need to start requiring that these animals are rehomed. That is, the suitable animals are rehomed. And so that'll have to attend to things like their history and welfare state. And that can frame future efforts of an organization like this one, because I think that's, if they commit to these core principles, I think we're good to go to agitate for rehoming these animals, again, as long as it's consistent with local statutes, that is, provincial and territorial. And that's it. There's the references I have for it. Again, I'll send this to Lori, the slideshow, so that anyone that wants it can have it. And then feel free to dive deeper into those documents.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andrew. I have a couple of things, but I see Carla's hand is up. So go ahead, Carla.
Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just wanted to hear what you had to say about the fact that often in these kinds of legislations, there is this pliable language where in the end, if human needs are more important, that,
right.
It goes over, the animals, regardless of maleficence or anything like that, or killing them or anything. Ultimately, when push comes to shove, if it benefits the human, then that is a priority over. Am I right with that? Or
yeah. This has been a standard problem for those that work in animal research ethics, and I count myself among them. This is a standard thing we wrestle with, because it's, there are arguments against it, but they have to be arguments against the view that humans are in some sense always a priority. And so I think the easiest way to see that that's not the case is think of any of you with companion animals. So if you have companion animals in your lives, doesn't really matter who they are, but imagine I have 3 cats in my life. When I adopt these cats from the shelter that's in our province, I sign an agreement that I'm going to do my best to give them a good life, and I take that seriously. Those are duties I take on. I wouldn't be adopting them if I wasn't going to do that. But that means that their priorities their interests enjoy a great deal of priority in my life. And so if they get sick, they go to a vet. We do what we can and can afford, but that means serious effort. It doesn't mean that you give up if it costs $20 to do something. You'd rather spend that on a coffee and donuts, although those would be expensive. Coffee and donuts, Starbucks. and so I think when you do that, there's something to notice that an ethicist like me or a philosopher like me would point out is notice that whatever you spend on your companion animals, you could have spent on a human charity that was very effective in reaching out to humans in need. It doesn't really matter what the charity is, just make sure it's a good one. This argument's not going to work if they waste money on admin, or they're not very good or competent about getting that money to who they say they're trying to help. But imagine a charity that really is good at this, that they do a good job. So Doctors Without Borders, for instance. So imagine it's something like that. If you could actually funnel that money to them instead of these your loved ones that are non-human in your life, then if humans are to enjoy ethical priority, that's what you should do. The fact that a whole bunch of us don't think you're doing anything wrong, and I would include myself here, if in fact you prioritize the companion animals you've adopted in your life, that's a crack in the veneer. The human interests always come first, because that doesn't make sense in that kind of context. In that kind of context, it's pretty clear that that's not going to capture everything that we do as folks that try to live well in the world. And so that would be my pitch I've talked to animal scientists about this. This is usually my pitch to them about how to see that there are cracks in the veneers of that. It looks obvious that humans should come first, but we actually don't often live that way. And what's more, not only don't we often live that way, what a number of us do when we prioritize cats and dogs or rats or budgies or snakes in our life, we're actually doing what we should be doing when we prioritize them, particularly if we've adopted them and have committed
a lot
to
of people
a
say
good
to me
life.
about the animal human argument, they
Yeah.
talk about as if it's an either or proposition,
Right.
which of course it isn't.
Right. No, no, of course. I mean, part of this is people tend to win an argument. They may actually make it sound like everything is really finite, so finite that if you put it in one direction, you can't do it in another. And of course,
Right.
it's we're not as restricted as that. And so you can do that same thing when you're talking about legal rights and protections for animals versus humans. There's no, ratio that you're actually eating into when you do this. You can have as many as you want. And so I think, and then it just comes down to energy and enforcement and staff. And so I think that's right. The 3 R's, the one thing to notice about the 3 R's that dissatisfies a number of us, and I would include myself here, is that when they talk about suffering, distress, and pain, they talk about what's necessary and unnecessary. Those are two big words in the 3R world. And so as long as it's necessary, you're good to go. Now, who decides what's necessary? Well, it has to do with whether it's good science. And of course, if that science is targeted towards benefiting humans, those humans and that target is always going to trump the animal use. And that gets to your comment, right? Is that's a problem. For those of us that work in animal ethics that want a better world than that, we start with things like what I've just talked about with companion animals, and try to get folks to see that they need an argument back. They can't assume it. They need to give me an argument that will defend the view that humans would enjoy such priority that we could basically decide ourselves what's in and what's out by what we'll call necessary, and then we do what we want. And the problem is that it's not actually easy to come up with an argument. And there's been a lot of us writing on this in this area of animal use for some decades now, and folks on the whole have failed to come up with a convincing argument that would allow us to, without qualification, prioritize humans over other animals. And so if you're in a conversation with folks, you can actually feel pretty confident that you're on pretty solid ground. Also, one of the things to notice about avoiding harm as well, folks will often think of this as, well, listen, if we start agitating for animals, aren't we endangering humans? Well, I mean, that's an interesting question, but that comes down to whether the animals we use are used well in science. And if you now start looking at failure rates of translation of animal research into human treatments, it's over 90%.
Mm-hmm.
Now, who's getting harmed there? Well, if there were other alternatives in using animals as models for humans, when we know that humans are the best model, and Russell and Birch in 1959, in their book on humane treatment, they say this, the best animal model for modeling humans are humans. That's hands down. So when you're using other animals, you're using a diminished model. Mm-hmm. It's going to fail in some sense or other. And so given that that's true, we could be harming humans a great deal by restricting ourselves to certain kinds of procedures like using animals in research, where if we actually thought harder to use new approach methodologies, that's a fancy word for non-animal based methodologies, that could actually be more human relevant, it may turn out that we could see breakthroughs that we're not yet discovering because we're limiting ourselves in the way we are to animal use. So harm, even the discussion of harm, is not straightforward. It's very complicated and depends on the success of the animals. So stroke research on rats hasn't yet developed any treatment that's useful for humans. And so when you think of those kinds of numbers of failure, is that a respectful use of animals? Is that really avoiding unnecessary harm? So your insight, Grant.
Thank you, Julia. Just I'll get to you in 1 second. And I think that's such a good point. And I also so much believe that the question too, is that really respectful to humans? Even if you're so concerned about humans and your argument is that they come first, one would think that you would want the best model for fighting and curing disease. And if that's the failure rate is such that it's 90%, you're not really respecting humankind either. So it's kind of interesting. Yeah. I just wanted to just kind of jet back for a moment about it is a powerful rehoming draft that the CCAC has come up with, finally, right? And hopefully in good timing with us as an organization to have the argument that these animals, and Mary and I have been blessed, to have worked for years, seeing that these animals can thrive and recover, and as has Carla actually. And so, we know that they can. But I want to talk a little bit about the fact that the slippery slope maybe of the organization that is attempting to get accredited or keep their accreditation, really, they could decide what is harm. They could maneuver the goalposts, so to speak, could they not? So in order
Yeah.
because they're the ones interpreting whether it's in the best interest, if it's harmful to the animal, or mercy, or et cetera, et cetera. If the actual
Right.
Institution is determining this, then essentially it's moving the CCAC guidelines to fit what works for them. Am I accurate?
Well, it's a nice line of reasoning. I mean, you're certainly onto something. The things to watch out for are, so the CCAC is a huge overarching organization, whereas what you're talking about are the institutional level oversight. And so the CCAC, if you go to their website, they're the first to admit that their success will stand or fall on the efficiency of the animal care committees at the relevant institutions. That's local oversight. So this now becomes a question of the animal care committees at the local institutions, how they interpret the guidelines. Now, because the guidelines, I mentioned before, the guidelines go through a number of reviews. One of the reasons why they go through a number of reviews is to make them as crystal clear as possible. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't it doesn't mean that there aren't ambiguities in the regulations, but they do try to make them as crystal clear as possible. That relates to your question, because it means the animal care committees have less wriggle room than you might think for how to interpret the guidelines. Okay. But you are right that the animal care committee themselves have to actually make a judgment call about whether what's being proposed is genuinely necessary, whether it actually has sufficient benefit to actually warrant the harm that's being proposed to the relevant animals. And that with the 3 R's in mind, because the 3 R's are very present, as they are with the CCAC in their instructions to animal care committees, plus perhaps these core ethics principles, which will be a new set of principles at work here for animal care committees. But the 3 R's will still be there. And the 3 R's, you have to actually still ask the question, can we replace these animals? And if the answer is, well, yeah, we actually could, then the animal care committee shouldn't be approving that proposed protocol. They should be actually sending it back to the principal investigator or the relevant scientists and saying, no, if you're going to admit that you don't need to use these animals, then resubmit this proposal with the models that you think we do need rather than the ones you did. So there will be ways to do this. It is nevertheless very rare for animal care committees to out and out reject proposals from scientists. And this, I mean, asking why that's the case is a very vexed question, because I don't have insight into it, because I've never served on an actual animal care committee. I've only served on a subcommittee of the CCAC designing documents. I have a colleague, one of my law go-to people, that served on an animal committee for 3 years. And I could confirm with him what I'm about to claim to, what I've just said to you, but I think he'll back me up, that it's incredibly rare to have an animal care committee that'll say, nope, I don't care what agency has funded you. I don't care if it's NSERC. I don't care if it's CIHR. We are not approving this protocol, period. It's done. I think that's incredibly rare. What they do is they try to finesse the proposal to make sure it meets the guidelines as written and understood, and also the conscience of the animal care committee members who are making the final judgment as to whether they'll approve it or not. But you're right that there is wiggle room here. Now, if guidelines have been written well, less than you would think, but it still comes down to a judgment of, is there sufficient benefit in what's being proposed? Have they done enough to actually show that they must use the animals they're proposing to use, the number of animals they're proposing to use, and in the way they're proposing? Hopefully that helps.
It does. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thanks for waiting, Julia. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was actually going to say what you said earlier about how benefiting the animals actually also benefiting the human, because over here, our NIH also estimates about 96% of pivotal animal tests actually fail when translated, because animals hold diseases way less complexly than humans do. And it's never an accurate representation of how humans carry diseases when they're artificially induced into animals. And also over here, we've been talking about like virtual, like human models and like cell assays and in vitro kind of models that are more effective and actually more cost effective too. They cost a lot less than having to, get animals bred and brought over to the labs. So I just don't understand why these big companies like big pharma keep choosing to exploit animals for a way more expensive cost than like having like a virtual computer human model that costs way less and is actually proven to be more accurate than animal models over here at least.
Yeah, I mean, those are all good points. Here have been my responses to them. So there are some companies changing. So from what I understand of the big pharmaceutical companies, and this would be both in the US and elsewhere, the ones that have been trying to develop psychopharmaceuticals, so the ones that have to do with mental health, et cetera, they're pulling out of using animals because they've just so roundly failed. And so it's just not a good investment for them. And so if you Google some of this, you'll see newspaper reports of how some of the big pharmaceuticals are actually pulling out of this area. You also have some companies, and this is because of jurisdictions like the European Union, that now bans the sale of cosmetics that have been tested on animals. You have a number of cosmetic companies that are actually changing and becoming advocates of new approach methodologies as well that don't actually require animals. You're also right that there are some new approach methodologies that seem to be actually way more specific for what we're looking for in toxins than the use of in vivo models, that is living animal systems, whole systems. I was listening to a webinar today with Health Canada presenter and a Unilever presenter, and both of them were talking about how new approach methodologies, at least in certain areas of toxicology, seem to be more specific than animals, and so they're favoring moving to those what they call NAMs, those new approach methodologies, over animals. There's still things where that's not quite there yet, but your point about animals is still right, and this is an evolutionary point, is that our closest living relatives are chimpanzees and bonobos. Those are the ones on the planet that are the most closely related to us. Interestingly, we're their closest relatives. They're more closely related to us than anyone else on the planet. Nevertheless, chimpanzees have failed in past use in science to translate to us, and that's the significance of the journeys that we've been on as species in evolution. The differences that underlie, and some of the subtle differences that underlie our physiologies, are subtle enough differences to make it very difficult to use animals as helpful models of humans. And again, Russell and Birch were well aware of this. Again, the best animal model for humans is humans. And if you're going to go to other animals, you must recognize that you're using a diminished model. And then it becomes a game of, well, how do we figure out how to use them and make the judgment that it's safe to go to a human trial, given that we know it's a diminished model? And then they'll have various ways to work out, well, how much of confidence level do we have that the results we have from these animals are at a certain threshold that we can then move into use of humans. And then you're also right, as the NIH points out, that the failure rate is incredibly high. So even despite all of that, they continue to fail. And so all of that is, I mean, those are the ways I would add to your comments, and you can see how they all intersect with what you were saying. And I think what you're asking is a good set of questions about why this continues when the failure rates are so high. I think I have a colleague who teaches animal research at Stanford University in the States, and he's a good guy. He forces his PhD students and postdocs to actually ask these kinds of questions about their use of animal models. He uses knockout mice in what he does. And he's the first to admit that this is a serious problem. Joseph Garner is his name. So if you look up Joseph Garner on the web, you'll get a number of his papers where he critically discusses this and the need to be honest about the failure rates in animal use. And he's an animal researcher himself. And one of the points you made in your comments that I think is worth thinking about harder, and I wish more folks would, is the difference between spontaneous animal models and induced animal models. So you're mentioning that, we try to induce diseases in other animals that will actually resemble ours to then use them as a model for us. And the problem with induced modeling is you're not inducing our disease in them. You're actually having to change their physiological system to then begin to resemble the kinds of symptoms we associate within our categories of medicine with those diseases. Spontaneous models are models where these diseases express themselves just normally in these animals. So for instance, in zoo captivity, There's two regular disease problems for chimpanzees in zoos. One is obesity. So they get over because they're sedentary. They're not roaming around like they would do in equatorial Africa, and also cardiovascular disease. So they develop heart problems because, again, of their sedentary lifestyles. Now, those are, I mean, they're kind of induced because they're in captivity, but they're kind of not because they're not forcing it. And those are spontaneous models. And the problem with a whole bunch of our diseases is they seem to be unique to us. Think of Alzheimer's. There doesn't seem to be a comparable analog in other animals. You can do the same thing with autism. So they talk about autistic mice. Joe Garner has talked about this himself quite shortly on media, where they've asked him about his view of models, and he's the first to say there's no such thing as an autistic mouse. That's not happening. What they're talking about is a mouse that resembles certain characteristics of what we see in the population of folks on the spectrum, and then they run with that as an autism model, but that mouse does not have autism. And so whatever you're doing with that mouse is not going to translate, except by accident, to someone on the spectrum. So your distinction between induced and spontaneous models is a very important distinction. It'll generate a lot of debates. If there were scientists that were going to defend this, that give us a push on the spontaneous versus induced and say that, well, I mean, it depends on whether the mechanisms are conserved. So this is evolutionary speak for saying that there's certain traits that we share in common despite our evolutionary differences. So think of genes in our DNA. There are certain genes that have a recognizable role and conserved. If you think of neuroscience, so if you've ever heard the phrase neurons that wire together, neurons that fire together wire together, that's Hebb's law. It's not really a law, but it's Hebb's. Donald Hebb was a Canadian neuroscientist that came up with basically that way of saying things. It's neurons that fire together wire together, and neurons that fire apart wire apart. And so it's just a way of talking about neurons forming circuitry. One of the scientists I know in Dalhousie that uses animals in neuroscience, the reason why he uses zebrafish is that the mechanisms for learning in zebrafish are actually the mechanisms in our brains. And so you don't need to use even rats or pigs. You could actually use zebrafish and actually follow the ways in which neurons form certain circuitries as those zebrafish learn, and you would be modeling basic mechanisms that you see in humans. Now, when you're talking about very, very basically conserved mechanisms, then you could actually imagine that you could induce pathologies within those basic conserved mechanisms that then would begin to resemble what you see, even if they're unique to humans. And so there was a scientist in the room, they could give us a hard time on that. I would still maintain, though I wouldn't be, dogmatic about it, but I'd maintain that it is more reasonable to expect there would be more fruitful research to learn from if they were spontaneous over induced. And to think of benefit and benefit, if these are spontaneous diseases in other animals, the fact that we could find treatment for them may mean that we actually benefit them too. And so it could be a win-win when we limit ourselves to spontaneous models, if we're going to use animals at all in a way that is beneficial for humans. Induced is very, controversial. I can imagine a scientist giving us a hard time of giving you the argument for how they could. I wouldn't be wholly convinced by that, because it's going to be devil's always in the details.
Thank you so much. That's a good point. Julia, that you had made, that of course humans hold diseases in a different manner, and this is a personal statement by me, is that I believe they hold them in differently because of the holistic perspective. And the fact that, animals innately want to heal, whereas humans, for a variety of mental, emotional, etc. reasons, either hold on to disease or there's other blockages that are stopping the healing process. So based on that holistic model, and I don't see any other questions, so maybe we'll just wrap it up, because I want to say that I think that as people who care about this issue, or any issue in particular, our first response is, what can we do? And we get that question all the time. How can I help? Thankfully, there's so many people that want to help. And so, for us in our advocacy for, Carla had put in the chat about educating, of course, as part of our advocacy and you know, really advocating for non-animal use. But we do all know that animal testing is not ending tomorrow. And the CCAC is not going anytime soon, because people in Canada and outside of Canada are using animals. So in terms of the approach and the guidelines, how open, Andrew, is the CCAC to other ways, to other guidelines or improved guidelines while the animals are under their sort of care? And what I mean by that is, holistically speaking, my understanding is that animals in laboratories it's basic care. They get food, they get water, they get a small cage. They don't get to interact with each other. They don't really have, you know, the soft touch that we would love for them to have, and that we can't imagine that they don't. Would it be possible? What can people do? I guess two questions. Would they be open to some sort of holistic guideline that would allow in some way the animal to thrive a little bit better, or to have interactions with others, to have an improved holistic quality of life within the laboratory? And question number two, are they open to public, I don't want to say scrutiny, but, you know, public debate, or we as the public, you know, personally and individually contacting them and saying, hey, you know, what could you do about this, et cetera, et cetera? Or are they just this organization that truly, as you say, answers to nobody?
That last set of questions is hard to answer. I mean, you know, I'm you know, one of the member of the general public here, because I don't use animals in research. I write on ethics and teach on this stuff in philosophy classes. So, you know, I can serve on one of the subcommittees. I can serve on the animal care committee as a community rep, albeit a university, probably a university community rep rather than an outside the university community rep on their animal care committees. And so that allows for critical input. Also, that because there's layers of review and revision of documents, there are ways for the public to actually send in critical comments, because trust me, I've done it with that end of study outcome stuff. I sent in my own critical comments about the document. It's only 9 pages if you look at it, and if Laurie doesn't have a copy of it, I can send you a copy to share with folks who want to see it. It's a very short document. It's very easy to read, but it's not very coherent in certain parts, and so I had tried to point out where I thought there were tensions in the document, and if they ironed those out, there were certain things that they would do. That's one of my cats. There were certain things that they were suggesting that could be done that shouldn't be done given the principles they're committing to. And so there is public feedback. What I meant by them not being accountable, there's no one that we elect into government that we can hold heat to the fire and ask them to put on pressure on the CCAC to change certain guidelines. There's no one like that they report to, and so we have to use the mechanisms that they make available to the public to do it. Now, how open they are to actual open criticism, can't really answer that. The test of that is to actually try it out and see if you get any uptake from the organization. I mean, the folks that I've known and know in the CCAC are nice folks. They're like, I've had genuinely good conversations with me. I mean, these views that you've been hearing me talk about tonight, I've talked to them about. I haven't been shy about it, and they don't mind chatting with me about this stuff. I've had coffee with various folks who work that are animal researchers that work in areas like this, or are, you know, conservation scientists, just to lump in to make sure I have enough there to cover that plural use there. Some of I've only known a few that have worked for the CCAC, but the ones that I know are good folks, and they care about these animals, and they're not trying to find loopholes. They're just trying to work in a way, because they don't have any force of law, and because they get funding from NSERC and CHR, and they will never say this officially themselves, and this is me saying it, not anyone in that organization saying it, but they have to be very careful that they don't actually cut off the limb on which they sit to do the work they're doing. And so they need to do what they can to make things better for the animals that will actually be done in universities that use animals. So if you get too ambitious about this, you're going to cut off the limb you sit on, and that's it, you're done. Yeah. And so the way they get compliance is not to move quickly and not to move radically. And so, you know, it's it's a serious limitation to what's going on now. If they had force of law, they'd have a little bit more protection. It's one of the reasons why we need legislation, is to actually give the CCAC or whatever organization we want to do that work teeth and security, so they can actually respond in a positive way to more ambitious visions of animal use that comes out of general Canadian views of how we should be treating animals, because their mission is to actually to reflect Canadian values. And so it's very important, I think, to actually have them report to a ministry or department so we can ensure that that's the case. And like using the companion animal examples, I think lots of Canadians care deeply about their companion animals and would agree with us that those animals are rightly, properly cared for, instead of sending money to Doctors Without Borders. If in fact, going back to an earlier comment, they could only send it in one direction or another, right. I think they're not doing anything wrong by looking after their companion animals. And I think most Canadians would grant that.
Yeah.
And then you're off to the races. Then the disputes that we all have with each other are just minutia details. It's not over the big picture stuff of who comes first, because we can recognize things are too complicated for actually having that as a real question. Depends on the context and who you're talking about.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I agree, because I think that the majority of people, scientists are part of our community.
Yeah.
Went into their chosen field to help humanity. I don't think their goal is to harm or do harm. And you know, who are we, especially as an organization, to question anyone's motives that we don't know?
Yeah.
So it's very important for us as an organization to advocate for non-animal use. And we're not the judge and jury of the rest of the world, right? So, you know, and so we need scientists. They're amazingly brilliant and knowledgeable and educated individuals. And you know, I was just curious to, especially if the CCAC was open to, and again, not criticism, but, you know, public opinion. And as you say, if they want to reflect, you know, the Canadian landscape and you know, what Canadian values would represent, then, you know, possibly this is the time for, you know, further advocacy and, you know, just questioning and improving together. Because if you're building a community, you have to work together. It's not, you know, bashing the door down and saying, you know, you're awful, right? So, you know, hopefully as together we can build a community and just open the door to these questions and suggestions. And if they've already come up with this rehoming, which is a big thing, then, you know, there's some room. There's a sliver of the door has been opened, right? So
I think that's right. When you're talking to animal researchers, and if you do, I mean, remember everything you've said, Laurie. If any of the rest of the folks here talk to them, remember what Laurie said about, you know, lots of them care about the animals they use. In fact, there's burnout in labs from animal tech folks who they just can't take it anymore when they're actually getting attached to animals who they either induce pathologies into or may even have to kill them after their usefulness ends. And it takes chunks out of these people. And so, you know, that's a sign of folks that care. And so keep that in mind. Keep in mind that they do. I mean, if there are options for them to do better, then give them arguments for that. Also, remember that some of this is forced on them by regulations. Health Canada is one of the offenders here that will require certain animals in toxicology use. Now, I just said I was in a webinar with someone from Health Canada talking about near approach methodologies, but these are early days yet for Health Canada. And, you know, there are folks that are testing on animals because it's required by regulations, and they would rather do it than someone else because they're pretty confident they can actually treat these animals as well as they can while they induce incredible amounts of suffering. And so part of this is us as Canadians saying to our government, no, you need to replace, reduce, and refine, and stop requiring animals when we could actually use new approach methodologies. And that will free up scientists to do other things entirely. So yeah, I do remember that they're human. They'll also respond to good arguments. I've had lovely conversations with folks who use animals in research, where I've given them these kinds of pitches for re-seeing animals in research, and they're open to these conversations. They're not dismissive. I have never ran into a scientist who uses animals in science, and that's a good qualification, because I have ran into dismissive scientists, but not scientists that use them themselves, where they would just dismiss this view that humans aren't always a priority. And that's because they recognize the complexity of what they're talking about. And so they're not going to run with that easily. And so there is a shared space. These are folks you can reason with. And you know, it's important to listen. We're in fact, you know, replacement isn't ready to move from animals to new approach methodologies. It's important to recognize that too. I work in ethics, and so, you know, that wasn't so long ago that in human bioethics, there were a lot of healthcare practitioners and researchers that were really resistant to having their hands tied by ethical oversight. And I mean in the 1970s and 80s. And there are still folks in this world who are researchers and medical practitioners that go out of their way to violate the ethics, professional ethics codes they have for using humans in research. It's good if you're looking for a term to look this up just to check out whether I'm accurate or not. You're looking for the term ethics dumping, ethics and then dumping, as in. And then just look for that in human bioethics, and you'll find folks talking about it, because it continues to be a problem that researchers and some healthcare scientists go out of their way to avoid certain principles that restrict what they can do with humans, never mind other animals. And so when you're talking to animal researchers, remind them of that history, that it wasn't so long ago that lots of researchers on humans and healthcare providers would have been very resistant to people talking about better ethics for human use. And there are still folks that are resistant to that. And so, you know, the use of animals in science needs to catch up. They're about 40 years behind in that discussion. And, you know, that's what gives me optimism, is that the kinds of discussions you get now about animal use, wasn't so long ago they were resistant to any restrictions on human use for very similar arguments.
Right.
And so keep in mind that we're all on journeys, and this discussion's about 40 years behind where it was for human bioethics, but there's reasons to think we'll get better.
Well, I think your point about the government also is just excellent, in that you know, we as Canadians, I think in general, tend to forget that the government works for us, and we have a voice. We do have a voice, and so, you know, some of these people's hands are tied. And as a cosmetic formulator myself, I know very well that you can create cosmetics with known to be safe ingredients according to Health Canada, or you can create them with toxins. Why people want to use toxins, it makes no sense anyway. But so Health Canada is somewhat behind. I know that personally from industry. But I think, again, we have to keep in mind that our government is there, and we are the voice, and we're the ones who put them in their positions. And so it's important that if this is important to us, that we speak out and you know, speak to our MPs and you know, go from there and make a difference and have a voice that way. So, you know, the animals don't have a voice. So,
and can I just add something about, you were talking about animals being solitary housed versus in a more holistic, thinking of them as a whole, as an animal with all of the richness of a life through their life cycle. I mean, within the CCA guidelines, it's important to see that they take social and physical enrichment very seriously. And so social enrichment is they have contact with conspecifics that is members of their own species, not just the humans using them. And so most husbandry, which doesn't have to do with the actual science use, but what happens to the animals before and after use, will actually return a whole bunch of those animals to enclosures where there are members of their own species. So lots of animals actually do get to hang out with members of their species. The problems there is that they don't get to choose who they hang out with. These enclosures may be quite restrictive. Think of rats and mice enclosures. And that matters to these animals, because any animals that are social, it matters to them who they get to hang out with. And if they were free living animals, they would leave if they didn't want to hang out with these individuals, and they can't when they're forced into these enclosures. But social enrichment and physical enrichment, the enrichment as a term is simply a way of talking about making things more complex given the kinds of animal minds that we're talking about, of the animals that we're using. And so enrichment's really important to the CCAC. Now, it might be that certain science protocols require solitary housing, but the CCAC is very, very clear that that should be temporary. You shouldn't you shouldn't be holding what they call what you can call socially intense animals or intensely social animals. That is, animals whose proper development is affected by whether they have good social companionship. You shouldn't hold them in solitary housing for very long, and so they'll be very clear about that. And so they're very clear about what they call the welfare impacts, including the cumulative welfare impacts of animals in science. And that would include even just, they would include how you house them. So if animals are being housed alone, over time, that cumulative welfare impact will be very strong and negative.
Right.
And so the CCAC would then expect you to restrict what you could do with that animal in the future, and may even require you to euthanize them if they are deeply harmed by that solitary housing. So I think for lots of animals that are falling under the CCAC oversight, there is an expectation within their guidelines that they won't be solitary housed.
Okay.
If they're social animals.
Okay.
I mean, not all animals are not social. But.
Exactly. Thank you. Well, if nobody, I don't see any hands, and I know for you, Andrew, it's 11 o'clock already, and possibly for some of you guys, it's late. So I just want to thank everyone so very much. I did forget to say something at the beginning of this, and that's that we record all of these, and we do it for, well, number one, we would like to have the information. Number two, we can't answer everyone in the chat all the time. So we go back in case we haven't had a chance to answer you, and then we can answer you. Give me 1 second, Sherry, I see your hand up there. We do also want to use some of the clips on social media, but of course we would never do that without your permission. So once we download the video and the audio, etc., we will send a link that is not published for you to view, and we will send you an email with kind of the highlights, and we will say in the email, you know, please let us know if you do not want your face or voice or anything to be on. We certainly won't do it unless, I mean, we're going to do clips, but we want to hear from you if that's an issue. And our next town hall is on August 17th. And it's going to be a fun one because Camille Labchuk of Animal Justice is going to be here. And also Dr. Charu Chandrasekhara is going to be here from the CCAM. And they're going to share their personal stories about how they got so passionate about what they do. So I think it's going to be amazing. So thank you all so very much. We'll get you the email mid next week at the latest. And before we go, because Sherry's hand's up, go ahead, Sherry.
Hi, sorry, I was actually waving my hand earlier. I didn't realize it was a raise hand button, so I apologize.
That's okay. Go ahead.
So I'm just curious, Andrew talked about the CCAC and people having to write that there's, I guess part of the application, they have to write that there's no, or something about no alternatives to the animal research that people are submitting. Who decides that? And does that rely on the knowledge of the committee who's reviewing those submissions? Because, you know, is there any requirement to consult with, you've probably heard the University of Windsor has that new program for researching alternative to animal methods. Yeah. And so there are, and I mean, there are definitely some known alternatives that are supposedly quite effective. So I'm just curious to hear a little bit more on that, if you don't mind.
It's a fantastic question to end with. Charu Chandrasekhara, that's her group in the University of Windsor. That's so the person coming next time is the perfect person to ask that. You know, it'll depend on what you're talking about as to what's replaceable right now and what isn't. I think the goal should be for anybody that cares about animal use, the goal should be not to use animals for models for humans when this isn't a spontaneous model, and you know, the best model is the human. And so the goal should be the elimination of those animals used in science. And so that's where Charu's work comes through. Dr. Chandrasekhara's work in that University of Windsor group of alternative stuff. For who decides what's replaceable, That's a complicated question because the animal care committees have to ask that question. And if they don't have the relevant expertise to figure that out, and there's no one on campus that's willing to weigh in, they're kind of screwed. So they kind of, then they, I can't speak again because I haven't served an animal care committee, but it's reasonable to think that given that they're actually looking at proposed uses of animals, that at least a to be set period of time are funded by other agencies, that someone else has decided that's okay. Now, it doesn't mean that that's right, but that's a good question to ask. And yes, it does fall to the animal care committees to decide whether there are animals that can be, there are animals that are being proposed to be used that could be replaced. And no, they're not going to go talk to Dr. Chandra Sakura about which ones could be replaced. That's not going to happen, at least not most of the time. And there may even be experts on campus that just aren't willing to do this because they don't have the time to do it. It would be extra work and they may already be overworked. And so, yeah, it'll be the animal care committee that makes a final decision about whether they are replaceable or not. And of course, they'll do this in negotiation with the principal investigator or the lead scientist. And the lead scientist will have ways to make the argument that, of course, they can't be replaced. They need them. And if there's not an expertise in the room that can challenge that, then that's likely to hold a day. But it's a good question. It's one of those uncomfortable truths about what's going on with the animal care committees. And it's a lovely question to put your thumb on the pulse of something that needs to be corrected.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thanks, Sherry. Thank you all so much. If you have any emails or like further questions, you can email us at info@beaglefreedomcanada.org. I'm sure you have the email from the response Zoom, and hopefully we'll see you in a month at the next one. And we'll certainly get the information out and the recap out to you, as I say, mid next week. And Andrew, cannot thank you enough. This was beyond thorough as usual. I really
was a lot of fun for me.
Yeah, thank you so very much. We will,
and remember, folks can email me. Sorry to interrupt, but folks can email me if they want to, and I'll send you those slides.
Excellent. Okay, that sounds great. And we will, I will speak with you soon, Andrew, and hopefully see you when the two experts too as well are here. So everyone have a great night. Thank you again, and hopefully we'll see you soon. Take care.
And thanks for all the questions and comments. They were really great.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Stay safe.